Unlike my very prepared colleague here, I do not have slides. So this afternoon, I will be having a coffee chat with you all. So if you see me looking down, I'm just looking down at my notes. So in this presentation, I will be exploring two interrelated themes, approaching them through experiences and theories of citizenship as well as national membership. We're going to try to kind of parse the boundary between citizenship and national membership. The first theme is one that defined my childhood. As the child of, my mom was an overseas Filipino worker, and she left when I was 6 or 7, and my younger brother was about 2 or 3. And it also defined my own experiences of young adulthood, because as a young adult, I did a degree in nursing in the Philippines. So that whole stereotype of Filipinos being nurses, I went through that. I have a degree in nursing from the Philippines. The whole intent of that being like at the end of the degree, I would also go abroad to seek employment. Obviously, things happen between then and now because I am now pursuing a PhD in politics. But so these are the kind of the roots that define why my research looks like the way it does. The second theme follows the first and is the question that I am exploring in my doctoral studies. So first we look at the phenomenon of how the Philippine state has imposed a distinct set of expectations on a subgroup of its citizens, a subgroup that I call the global working class. For the Filipino global working class, there are patterns in their lives that have become naturalized as experiences that come along with being a Filipino citizen. And these patterns come together in a life course. So the life course is a term that I borrow from sociology, from Dr. Valerie Francisco Menchavez. And the main touch points of the life course of the Filipino global working class are the experiences of training to leave, the experience of leaving for employment abroad, and then the continuous longing to return home. So these are the three main touch points of the life course. However, as I seek to demonstrate in my research, the idea of affective citizenship, which in my work I have loosely defined as the phenomenon wherein members of the Filipino global working class who might have sought out, or maybe they already have, citizenship in their countries of employment, still maintain a relationship with the Philippines through the sending perhaps of personal remittances or other social cultural manifestations of affection. And I argue for the necessity of unsettling our ideas of what citizenship is. Because from the lived experiences of the global working class, it seems that citizenship is beginning to be experienced and understood differently due to the way that globalization and labor migrations have moved people across the world from one country to another. So in examining the life course of the Filipino global working class, we can see that the act of leaving is understood to be natural or has been naturalized in that it is not strange to embark on this, and imperative in that it is the thing to do because there aren't a lot of jobs at home. So this naturalized process of leaving is part of the cycle of necessary return. So both for the temporary nature of many employment contracts, as well as for the maintenance of relationships with those who have been left behind, like family and friends. So this geographic distance between individual Filipino overseas workers and the families that they have left behind at home are a necessary component to the maintenance of the flow of remittances back to the state, because the relative mobility of the Filipino laborer is part of their global appeal in being hired, that they don't have any connections that come with them. They are alone, they are bodies of labor, and they're employed as such. Rodriguez argues that the infrastructure is producing labor migration ensures that migrants, and I quote, especially if they have responsibilities or other close ties to family members or other kin in other homelands, are bound to return. So we're back to that cycle of leaving is necessary, but return is also necessary, or at least it's something that you are intended to seek. So thus, an assumed outcome of the life course of the global working class is that Filipinos abroad, and I quote, desire to return to and eventually retire in the Philippines. And this is an assumption that Aguilar interprets as a way of performing citizenship. So affective and social cultural ties to the Philippines need to be strong enough to transcend geographic distance, time differences, and other competing loyalties. These ties or emotional attachments are understood to be distinct or separate from legal or state attachments, and the performance of or doing affective acts, such as participating in the remittance cycle, are seen as an avowal of continuous allegiance. So the Philippines, as a labor brokerage state, or a state that whose role in the global labor market is to broker its people as laborers to the world, has successfully convinced its global working class that leaving the territories of the nation to seek employment beyond national boundaries is a natural expectation of Filipino citizens. This has, Rodriguez argues, reconfigured ideas of national belonging to encourage its citizens to leave the Philippines while simultaneously fostering their ties to the homeland. So the act of leaving creates strong emotional and capital ties because of what has been left behind. You left behind your family and other social connections. You leave behind spaces and imaginations of home, and you leave behind where you feel like you belong. And these are things that are very strong in labor diasporas. So in exploring the concept of effective citizenship in the Philippines, I draw on Aguilar, for whom effective citizenship manifests in the form of sending remittances, making frequent visits, and again, desiring to retire in the homeland at the end of the life course. This indicates a transformation in the meanings of the notions of citizenship. So Filipino migrant citizenship now seems to be a spectrum that ranges from legal status to acts that are performed by individuals that indicate their continued participation in the Philippines as members of the nation. So, for example, in the debates that occurred for and against the reacquisition of Philippine citizenship by those who had lost it through becoming citizens of other states, proponents emphasized that notwithstanding naturalization elsewhere, and despite being stripped of Philippine citizenship, these immigrants persisted in their acts of continuing allegiance. So there is an interpretation of these acts, as one congressman puts it, as an innate category of natural allegiance to the country, which they claim cannot be separated from the body. So it is embedded in the Filipino body. Allegiance, then, from this perspective, is understood to exist again within the body. You can't separate it. And this is made more interesting by this whole context of imperatives of leaving and imperatives of returning. I think it's made more interesting by the fact that the penultimate line in the Philippine national anthem, aming ligaya na pag may mga api ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo, roughly translates to, it would be our joy to give up our lives for you in times of oppression, or when someone oppresses you, you as in the nation. And I argue that the ideals of effective citizenship in the Filipino context can be understood as rooted in this explicit expression of the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good. So in his analysis of states and state membership, Brubaker contends that membership is a status that, quote, should be sacred, and that citizens must make sacrifices for the state, an understanding of the citizen-state relationship that seems to be reflected very deeply in Filipino culture. So Aguilar asserts that in Philippine history, love of the nation, but not of the state, making a distinction there, commands sacrifice. And that, quote, love in relation to the nation, that is a lot of rhyming, but love in relation to the nation has been at the forefront since the rise of national consciousness in the late 19th century. So national love, rooted in the context of colonial Philippines, is something that is defined in the sacrificial. It's very intimately understood to be along those lines. And Aguilar makes the argument that for matters of political belonging, identity and territory did not have to coincide. And this is an argument that carries a lot of weight for countries with sizable diasporic populations, for example, the Philippines. And the Philippines, in sending out its global working class for employment abroad, needs to find ways by which to maintain an effective form of citizenship that exists separate from its national boundaries or distinct from them. One way that this national membership has been strengthened is through the raising of labor migrants to the status of modern-day heroes, who made the voluntary choice to leave and are icons of sacrificial love, not only for their families, but also for their nations. For So for the objects of the state, for the Filipinos who are part of the global working class or who are commodified as objects of the state, certain sacrifices are expected, and in return, these sacrifices are revered. So they're considered heroes for doing this. The contemporary casting of Filipino labor migrants as heroic is an example of what Shapiro characterizes as a management of historical narratives, which is necessary to the symbolic maintenance of the nation state. So global labor migrants not only maintain the labor state through personal remittances, but they maintain the image of it, or the things that define it in contemporary understandings. So Rodriguez argues that what has emerged in the Philippine context is a form of migrant citizenship in the sense that membership in the Philippines is increasingly construed as actually requiring employment overseas. So to be Filipino is, to have the imperative of leaving and returning. Not only is the act of leaving natural, it is also required. By way of a conclusion, the Philippine state has chosen to frame overseas employment as involuntary and altruistic economic exile, or a noble act of nationalistic sacrifice, which downplays the state's failure to provide employment within its own borders. This has served to further the ideals of sacrifice that are already deeply rooted in national mythology, with the Filipino citizen undergoing a reinvention. According to De Los Reyes, from an individual person working and fulfilling his or her full potential for the nation, within the nation, to someone who makes sacrifices for the good of his or her family. As a sacrificial heroic Filipino, the global working class fulfills the narrative of the life course that is imposed upon them by the state, and that the state has determined to frame the act of leaving as a choice that an individual makes for various reasons, and not as the requirement for steady employment, social mobility, and stability that it has effectively become, serves to make more palatable the economic necessity of the personal remittances sent back by the global working class, which in 2009 totaled to 9.3% of the national GDP, according to the World Bank. And that's where I ended. Thank you.